I'm going to use the word zine a lot for the next 10 minutes, so I figured it would be a good idea to tell you, before I start, what zines are. Zines are small, self-produced booklets or mini-magazines. Zine making can be traced back to at least the 1930s, when it became popular among science fiction writers. Because they were generally inexpensive to create and produce, zines were accessible to a wide range of people. In the 1990s, zines became an important part of riot girl culture. Originating in Olympia, Washington in the early 1990s, Riot Grrrl was a musical and social movement rooted in third-wave feminism that centralized girls in music and subculture scenes. Riot Grrrl helped to define zines as a space for teenage girls to speak to each other and to the public about the things that they faced. Girls writing about their experiences of sexism, rape, heteronormativity, racism, and mental illness, just to name a few, gained access to communities of other zinesters experiencing similar things. It is important to note that although zine culture of the 90s is often associated with Riot Grrrl, the two were not intrinsically linked. Riot Grrrl as a subculture was predominantly composed of white, middle or upper middle class women. Historiography often places Riot Grrrl as central to girl zines of the 90s. This erases histories of women of color and queer people who were making zines at the same time. In my project, I look at the myriad of zine networks of the 90s that existed within and outside of Riot Grrrl. Last summer, I worked as a cataloger for a 5-college digital humanities project called Zines, a collaboration between 5 college faculty and librarians Alana Coumbier, Michelle Hardesty, and Leslie Fields, among others. My work involved gathering metadata, which in this case means data describing the physical zines I was looking at. I recorded things like places of publication and whether a zine was printed black and white or in color. The database was intended as a research tool, an advanced finding aid for students interacting with archival zine collections. As I looked at my spreadsheet, however, I began to ask myself what this metadata, on its own, could tell me. I started off making geographic maps. Zine exchanges in the 90s were often direct physical trades, but zines still traversed geographic boundaries. Often, zines became envelopes and were sent through the mail. Because of this, almost every zine I looked at had an address written on the back. I worked with CartoDB, a web-based cartographic mapping program, to map where zines were being produced, wondering if I could find trends that would tell me something. I soon realized, though, that I was working with zine collections donated by individuals. To do any sort of conclusive analysis on where zines were being produced, I'd need to look at thousands of zines. Early on in my metadata collecting, I noticed that many zines I looked at reviewed other zines. I kept track of this information, curious about what it could reveal about networks. I decided to use Twine, a text-based game-building platform, to start to chart out connections between zines. Twine is similar to a choose-your-own-adventure novel, where each passage links to a variety of different passages depending on which answer the user chooses. Twine is definitely not designed to map networks. What I'm showing you now is actually the back end of Twine, the part that's not supposed to be the final product, the part that you're never supposed to see. On the map I'm showing you here, each square represents a different zine. The map shows 1,017 zines. For the zines I have information about, when you click on a passage you can find metadata in it. I have information about around 150 of the zines in this map. The rest are only titles, zines that other zines have reviewed, that I haven't yet found in archives. Over the course of this fellowship, I have visited 2 zine archives, the Sally Bingham Center at Duke University and the Queer Zine Archive Project in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. At these archives, I have worked to fill in some of those blanks and trace the limits of different networks. When we zoom in, zine titles are visible as well. There are also arrows between the zines which indicate who was mentioning who. This has been really helpful as a research tool in determining different types of zine networking. Twine is incredibly difficult to use as a network map. Currently, the app takes 10 minutes to open due to the sheer size of the game file. In addition, I can't view the entire thing at once. The application won't zoom out far enough. In order to pan around the way I did in that video, I actually had to set my screen to a really high aspect ratio. It's interesting to note that zines resisted being mapped and Twine resisted doing the mapping, and yet Twine became the most effective technology that I used, and the only one that functioned as both a visual aid and a research tool simultaneously. I explored other, cleaner ways of mapping zines. I worked with D3.js, a JavaScript library of creative visualizations, to create what's called a force-directed map. I'll be honest, I did not start out on this fellowship as a person who was comfortable with code, and learning to work with JavaScript was frankly terrifying. In addition, my dataset was really difficult to wrangle. I had to spend a lot of time hand-entering data. The whole process felt uncomfortably streamlined, though. As you can see, there are a lot fewer zines on this map than there were in my Twine game, around 160. For this software, it made more sense to only map zines that are connected to 2 or more other zines. Force maps are designed based on charged subatomic particle interactions. Dragging the map around creates interesting effects. Depending on which zine you drag it by, and how connected that zine is, the map will either move a lot or a little. One problem with this type of map is that it doesn't distinguish the connectedness of a zine based on whether that zine mentioned a lot of other zines, or was mentioned by a lot of other zines, a really big difference. For example, from this map, it looked like the zine Caught in Flux, a music zine, was incredibly popular. In fact, hardly anyone mentioned Caught in Flux, it just reviewed a lot of other zines. On a software like Twine, directionality of a connection is a lot easier to display because Twine is story-based in structure. In some ways, though, D3 does help me to visualize things that Twine can't. On D3, for example, I'm able to begin to chart out subsections of zine communities by using color to highlight certain titles. In this case, I was curious about zines that I knew were written by people of color and the ways in which they existed in networks. What I discovered is that many of the zines written by people of color that I looked at mentioned each other's zines directly, and that there were fewer degrees of separation between them. These zines, though often historiographically invisible, were very connected to other zine networks at the time. Zines like Bamboo Girl and You Might As Well Live were heavily influential and served as hubs to both other zines by women of color and to the networks at large. I thought that D3 would help me to detangle the dataset that had become so complicated in Twine. But try as I may, D3 was no more organized, and in fact it told me less. The more I tried to force zine data into neat visualizations, the more the zines themselves pushed back against them. When trying to map by genre, I had to contend with the fact that many zines refused to be categorized. I had to make choices. Is this zine more of a personal zine or a music zine? Where does the intent of the zine writer end and my intent begin? And the fact was that in 1993, if you were actually immersed in the zine cultures I've been studying, you wouldn't have seen any of this. With thousands of zines sitting in archives and a whole slew of digital tools available to me, I can visualize what, at the time these zines were produced, was completely invisible. The final form of my project is the other side of the Twine map. It's actually a game. So here's the main page of the game. You start out in the zine library. Basically, the idea is that it's sometime in the 90s, and you're in a bookstore or an info shop or something, and there are all of these zines there. You've never had access to a zine before, but you're enthralled, and you want to read more of them. By clicking a link, you pick a zine up. So let's say you click on Bamboo Girl. Here's a picture of the zine, and some of the metadata I've collected about it. Ideally, you would have read the whole zine, but for ethical reasons I've chosen not to digitize any zines, and to try to get the concepts of them across through metadata instead. Anyway, here you are reading Bamboo Girl. You'll see there's a list of other zines that are mentioned in Bamboo Girl. Let's say I pick Girl Hero. Now, I know from my Twine map that there are actually 2 zines that mention Girl Hero, Bamboo Girl, which is where we came from, and Yop. But I haven't looked at a copy of Girl Hero, and I don't have any metadata for it, and neither does the 1996 edition of You. Maybe you wrote a letter to the writer of Girl Hero, but they never wrote you back. Maybe you looked for the zine in the library, but, not finding it, you give up. The object of this game is to navigate through networks without hitting any dead ends. It is intentionally frustrating. As you play, you may begin to chart out connections in your head. If you play long enough, those connections might become more elaborate. When I showed Chris, one of the founders of the Queer Zine Archive project, my Twine map, he told me that it looked something like what he imagines in his head when he thinks about zine networks. But while now, 2 decades later, I can visit archives, use computers, make maps, when these networks were being built, folks couldn't see the whole network at once. They had to feel their way through it. In working with 2 sides of Twine for this project, I sought to replicate 2 sides of the experience of tracing networks.